Before we go inside, I want you to forget the comfortable version of the past for a moment. Do not picture the soft candlelit scene that films like to give us, with clean wooden tables, calm faces, golden firelight, and everyone somehow looking peaceful at the end of the day. The house we are entering is smaller than that, harder than that, and far more alive. There is no electricity waiting quietly behind the walls, no clean water ready to appear with the turn of a handle, no hidden heating system keeping the air gentle while the family forgets the cold exists. In this house, every comfort has to be made by someone, carried by someone, watched by someone, protected by someone, and if one small thing fails at the wrong moment, the night can change very quickly. That is the part most people miss. They imagine the fire before they imagine the fear of losing it. They imagine candlelight before they imagine the labor and smell of making candles. They imagine supper before they imagine that most of the food was already decided by season, poverty, preservation, and yesterday's leftovers. They imagine children asleep under handmade quilts before they imagine the darkness pressing against the walls so completely that even a familiar room could begin to feel strange. And tonight we are going to follow that darkness from the moment it first appears. Because this story does not begin at midnight. It begins at sunset. And for an ordinary family in the 1700s, sunset was not the gentle, romantic ending we like to think of today. It was not just orange light across a field, not just the pretty hour when the sky turns gold and people reach for a camera. For them, the sinking sun was a warning. It meant the household had entered its final race against light, and every unfinished task had suddenly become urgent. What had to be done before the darkness arrived? More than you might think? And what could happen if they failed? That is where this ordinary evening stops feeling ordinary. Before we step fully into that house, if this kind of story is the kind that pulls you in, if you like history, when it feels close enough to touch, not as a list of dates, but as smoke, hunger, warmth, fear, silence, and people trying to make it through one more night, then subscribe when the story earns it, and leave a like when some detail makes you pause. You do not need to do it now. Wait until something here feels real. And if you want to tell me where you are watching from tonight, whether you are in bed, on the couch, at a desk, in the kitchen, after everyone else has gone quiet, or somewhere in the world I may never have heard of, write it in the comments, because those little messages make these old rooms feel less empty. Now dim the lights a little if you can. Let the modern world soften around the edges. And come back with me to an evening around the year 1740, somewhere in rural colonial America. Picture a small farm, maybe in Pennsylvania, maybe in Virginia, far enough from a town that night does not arrive gradually under lamps and windows and distant roads, but all at once as a real presence. There is a house here with one main room, perhaps a loft above it, perhaps a rough lean-to attached at the back where tools, wood, dried goods, and sometimes even a sick animal might be kept when winter became too harsh. The floor may be bare earth or rough boards. The walls may let in thin fingers of wind. The roof may creak when the weather shifts. And inside this one small structure, a family of 6 or 7 people lives almost entirely on top of itself.
This is where they cook.
This is where they eat. This is where they sleep. This is where they pray. This is where they become ill, recover, argue, mend clothes, tell stories, discipline children, make plans, and wait out the dark. It may be only 20 feet wide and 16 feet deep, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, but for this family, at this hour, it is the center of the world. And look outside. The sun is beginning to drop. You might expect the family to pause, to admire the light spilling over the fields, to feel some gentle gratitude at the close of the day. And maybe someone does notice it for a second. Maybe a child glances up at the color in the sky. Maybe the father sees the last light on the fence rails as he crosses the yard. But no one has the luxury of simply watching it. The mother is not admiring the sunset. She is measuring it. She knows, almost without thinking, how much time is left by the way the light sits on the doorframe, by the length of shadows across the yard, by the dimming corners of the room. She knows what still has not been done. She knows which child is outside. She knows whether the animals are secured, whether the water vessels are full, whether the fire is strong enough for the evening and safe enough for the night. She knows that once the sun drops too low, every simple task becomes harder, slower, and more dangerous. This is difficult for us to understand now because we live after the conquest of darkness. We forget that for most of human history, daylight was not atmosphere. It was permission, it was schedule, it was law, it was the difference between what could be done safely and what had to be risked. In colonial America, as across much of rural Europe in the 18th century, the working day was shaped by light. People spoke of labor from first light until dark because that was how life actually worked. In some places, including Virginia, this rhythm was backed by legal expectation, carried over from older English labor statutes that required able-bodied people outside the upper classes to work from sunrise to sunset. The sun was not merely in the sky, it governed the day, and when it began to disappear, the house had to move. So let us walk through that last hour slowly because this is where the pressure begins. The first urgent matter was livestock. Not because animals were charming, not because the farm looked better with them, but because those animals were the family's economy breathing in the yard. A cow meant milk, and milk could become butter or cheese. Chickens meant eggs. A pig meant meat for winter. A horse or ox, if the family was fortunate enough to own one, made hard land possible to work. These were not possessions in the casual sense. They were food, labor, wealth, and survival gathered into living bodies. So what happens if one is left unsecured after dark?
This is not a small question.
The countryside was not as gentle as we tend to imagine from a distance. It was not just open fields, split rail fences, and moonlight on barns. It had predators. Foxes hunted. Wolves still threatened livestock in parts of colonial America well into the 18th century. Depending on the region, coyotes and other animals could be a danger too. A chicken left outside overnight might simply be gone by morning. A pig that slipped through a loose gate could vanish into brush and woodland. A cow that found a weak place in the fence after dark might wander far enough to cost the household a day it could not spare. So in the last light the children run. The oldest child may be driving chickens into the hen house and counting them under their breath, not because someone told them to practice numbers, but because one missing hen is a real loss. One hen is eggs that will not be laid, food that will not be eaten, value that will not be recovered easily. Another child may be carrying water to the animals because discovering at dawn that the cow has nothing to drink means the morning begins badly before the work has even begun. A smaller child may be sent for a tool, a rope, a latch, a bucket, some small thing that suddenly matters because the light is almost gone.
And where is the father? Probably at the fence line.
He is tired already. His back hurts. His hands may be cracked. The day has not been gentle with him. But tiredness does not close a fence, so he walks the boundary and checks the weak places. He looks for a rail that shifted, a post that loosened, a gap where an animal might push through after dark. To modern eyes, a fence may seem like scenery. To this family, it is one of the thin lines between order and loss.
Because a broken fence could mean a missing animal.
A missing animal could mean less food. Less food could mean winter tightening around the family in ways no one wanted to name. And all of this had to be handled before the sun disappeared. Now stop for a moment and imagine the same yard an hour later. The hen house is a darker shape against the darker barn. The well is somewhere beyond the door, but you cannot see the path clearly. The ground that was familiar at noon has become uncertain. A root, a stone, a forgotten tool, a patch of mud, all of it can catch a foot because the world has lost its edges. If you must go outside now, you carry a lantern, but the flame is small and nervous, and one hard breath of wind can take it from you.
That is what they were racing.
Not a deadline.
Not inconvenience. Darkness. Real darkness.
The kind most of us have never stood inside long enough to understand. And this is why every completed task before sundown mattered. Each one was a problem removed from the night. Each one was one less reason to step into that blackness later. One less risk, one less uncertainty, one less thing that could go wrong when there was no easy way to fix it. But while all this is happening outside, another race is taking place inside the house. The fire has to be prepared. And here is the question that changes everything. What happens in a 1700s household if the fire goes out? Not what happens if the fire becomes low. Not what happens if someone needs to add wood. What happens if it truly dies? The answer is that the family loses more than warmth. They lose light, cooking, comfort, and the beginning of the next day. Fire in this house is not decoration. It is not a pleasant detail. It is the engine of the evening. It is the stove, the heater, the lamp, the heart of the room, and the one thing no one can afford to treat casually. There are no modern matches in this house. There is no lighter in a drawer. Starting fire from nothing means flint, steel, tinder, breath, patience, and skill. A spark must be struck and caught in something dry enough to hold it. Char cloth, bark, moss, tow, a fragile little nest of material prepared for that exact purpose. Then someone must coax that spark into a glow, the glow into flame, the flame into kindling, the kindling into wood. On a good day, with dry materials and experienced hands, it might take only a few minutes. On a damp morning, with cold fingers and stubborn tinder, it can take much longer. Sometimes it fails.
And if it fails when the house is cold, everyone feels it.
So the central rule is simple. The fire must survive the night. The mother knows this better than anyone. While the children are outside and the father is walking the fence, she is studying the hearth with the practical intelligence of someone whose decisions will shape the whole evening. How much wood can be burned now? How much should be saved? How hot does the fire need to be for supper? How low can the coals be banked later? Will there be enough live heat in the morning to wake the fire again?
And there is a hidden calculation underneath all of this.
Wood is not free simply because trees exist. Every log near that hearth has already cost the household something. Someone cut it, someone split it, someone carried it, someone stacked it to dry, someone protected it from rain. A piece of wood burning tonight may represent labor done weeks or months earlier, and once it is gone, it is gone. Waste is not an aesthetic problem here. Waste has consequences. So when she places wood on the fire, she is not merely warming a room. She is spending stored labor. She is deciding how much of the household's future heat can be used in the present. No one in the house may call that impressive. No one may even notice the calculation unless it goes wrong, but the whole family is depending on it. Then there is the water, and water in this world is never just water. For us, it is almost invisible because it arrives so easily. We turn a tap, fill a glass, wash a hand, run a bath, rinse a plate, and rarely stop to feel the miracle of it. But in that farmhouse, every drop inside the room has been carried there by someone. A gallon of water weighs more than 8 pounds. A family may need 10 or 15 gallons between evening and the next morning for cooking, drinking, washing, animals, and the first tasks of the day. That means repeated trips to the well or stream, and those trips are best made before dark because drawing water after nightfall is slow, awkward, and risky.
So who carries it? Often a child.
Old enough to manage the bucket, young enough to still be sent without question. Picture that child walking to the well as the light thins, lowering the bucket, hearing it strike the water below, pulling the rope hand over hand, feeling the weight rise slowly, then carrying it back while water knocks against the sides and spills cold against their legs. One trip is not enough. Two are not enough. They go again and again. The arms ache, the air cools, the path grows less visible, but the vessels inside must be filled, because a house that wakes without water wakes already behind. By our standards, this would be an exhausting chore. For them, it was an ordinary evening. And that is what keeps striking me about this world. How much of survival was hidden inside ordinary routine? These people were not preparing for some dramatic emergency. They were simply doing what had to be done because night was coming, and night was always serious. I want to ask you something here. When we speak today about taking care of ourselves, we often mean rest, boundaries, slowing down, choosing peace, protecting energy. Those things matter, and I am not dismissing them. But in this house, care looked different. Care meant getting the chickens in before the fox came. Care meant carrying water before the path disappeared. Care meant banking the fire so the morning could begin. Care meant doing the necessary thing before the world became too dark to do it safely. Their self-preservation was not soft. It was practical. It was physical. It was urgent. And perhaps what moves me most is that they probably did not think of it as remarkable. They did not congratulate themselves for resilience. They did not name the pressure they lived under. The sun was going down, the animals needed securing, the water needed carrying, the fire needed tending, and so they moved through the work, because not moving was not an option. There is a kind of strength there that does not announce itself. The kind that does not look heroic until 300 years later, when someone sits in an electrically lit room and realizes how much of another person's life was spent making sure darkness did not win too easily. Now return with me to the farmhouse, because the last of the daylight is almost gone. The chickens are inside, the pig is shut in, the cow has water, the fence has been checked, the buckets have been filled, tools are being brought in or leaned where they can be found again. The father comes back from the barn with the heavy silence of a body that has worked since morning. The oldest child is still moving, still watching, still making sure nothing has been forgotten. The smaller children have drifted toward the hearth, drawn by warmth and by the instinctive knowledge that the house is becoming the only safe place left. The smell inside is wood smoke, damp wool, earth, iron, and food thickening slowly over heat. The fire cracks, the walls creak. Somewhere outside, an animal shifts in its pen. The wind touches the house as if testing it. And above everything, the sky darkens fast. The stars begin to appear, clear and crowded in a way modern people almost never see, because there is no artificial glow for miles to weaken them. The Milky Way may stretch overhead like a pale road through the black. It is beautiful, yes, but the beauty is not soft. It does not mean leisure. It does not mean romance. To this family, it means the day's work has crossed its border and the night has officially begun. So what happens after the door closes?
That is where the real evening begins.
Because now the house becomes a small island of firelight surrounded by a darkness that has no interest in being friendly. The hearth becomes the center of everything. Supper will be served, but it will not look like the meal you probably imagine. The table will reveal who has power and who does not. The candle, if one is lit, will cost more than you think. The mother's work will continue long after the others begin to slow down. The children will be put to bed with words that speak openly about death. And before morning comes, this family may have to face cold, sickness, fear, prayer, silence, and the strange intimacy of sleeping close because there is nowhere else to go. We have only crossed the threshold. The night is not empty, it is waiting. Before we talk about what this family eats, we have to stay beside the fire for a little longer, because if you do not understand the hearth, you cannot understand the evening. The whole house is turning toward it now. The door has been closed against the dark, the last outdoor tasks are finished, the children have drifted inward, and the room is beginning to depend on one living center of heat and light that must not be allowed to fail.
Listen for it.
That low crackle in the room. It is not a dramatic sound. It does not announce itself the way thunder does, or a church bell, or a storm against the roof. It is smaller than that, almost ordinary, the sound of wood breaking down slowly under flame, of air being pulled through embers, of heat shifting from one log to another. But in this house, that sound is not background, it is reassurance. It tells everyone inside that supper can still happen, that the room can stay warm, that morning may begin more easily than it would if those coals went cold. And here is the question most people never ask when they imagine a firelit colonial home. Who is responsible for keeping that sound alive? Because the fire is not just there. It does not remain because the family likes the look of it. Someone has been tending it all day, judging it, feeding it, holding it back when wood must be saved, building it up when cooking demands heat, covering it carefully when the night must carry a coal into morning. A modern room can be warm without anyone thinking about the source of warmth. This room cannot. Every comfort in it has a person behind it. If you stepped into that farmhouse now, the fireplace would probably shock you first by its size. Do not imagine a narrow, decorative opening with a few logs placed neatly for beauty. A working hearth in the 1700s was closer to a piece of household machinery than a feature of interior design. In older colonial homes, especially in New England, the cooking fireplace could be wide enough for a person to stand partly inside it, and that is exactly what women often had to do, stepping onto the hearthstone with heat against their arms and smoke above their heads, moving pots, adjusting iron hooks, shifting coals, and working in a space that could injure them at any careless moment.
Think about that for a second.
The warm, pretty fire we imagine as comfort was also danger, labor, burns, smoke, ash, and judgment. A woman cooking there had to know how close to stand, how far to reach, how quickly a pot might boil over, how a change in flame could ruin what little food the family had. One wrong movement could burn a sleeve. One child too close to the hearth could be badly hurt. And yet the family could not move away from it, because the thing that threatened them was also the thing keeping them alive. Some fireplaces were so large that a small seat or sheltered corner could be built into the chimney area, a warm nook where a child might curl up on a bitter night and feel, for a short while, that the whole world had narrowed to heat and shadow. But even that comfort tells you something. The best place in the house was not the softest chair or the quietest bedroom. It was the place nearest the fire, because heat was uneven, light was uneven, and comfort had a geography. The hearth made the room into a map. Closest to it you were warm and visible.
A few steps away you were already in dimness.
Near the walls you felt the cold returning. And once you understand that, you begin to see why the household gathered the way it did. They were not arranging themselves for charm. They were obeying the physics of survival. Now look at the tools around that fire, because each one tells a small part of the story. There may be an iron crane fixed into the chimney wall, a hinged arm that can swing out toward the room so a heavy pot can be checked without reaching directly into the blaze. There are andirons holding burning wood in place. There are long-handled forks, tongs, a poker, a trivet, perhaps a heavy Dutch oven with a flanged lid, meant to sit among the coals with more coals piled on top, so food can bake from below and above at the same time. Nothing here is decorative. Everything has a purpose, and most of it can hurt you if you use it badly. So how does a woman cook? Without dials, without a thermometer, without a timer, without a stove, without anything that tells her the temperature except her own experience. That is where this room becomes more impressive than it first appears. She reads the fire. She knows which wood burns fast and which wood holds a coal. She knows that oak, ash, and hickory can give long, steady heat, while pine flares quickly and fades. She knows that green wood smokes and resists the flame because it still carries too much moisture. She knows that a bed of coals is different from open flame, and that certain foods need one while others need the other. She knows how to rake embers to one side for fierce heat, spread them thin for something gentler, or bury a pot in warmth so a slow meal can develop over hours. No one has taught her this as science, but it is science all the same. Not written in formulas, written in hands. Written in repeated mistakes. Written in the memory of meals saved just before burning, bread pulled at the right second, beans softened slowly enough to feed everyone, and porridge kept from scorching because someone listened to the pot before the smell turned bitter. I want to be very clear about something here. It is easy to talk about the women of the past as though they were merely doing simple domestic work because they did not have modern machines or professional titles. But running a hearth-based household was not simple. It required skill, memory, endurance, thrift, timing, and an almost constant awareness of what was happening in the room. The fire had moods, the wood had limits, the pot had needs, the children had hands that wandered too close, the household had only so much food, only so much fuel, only so much daylight, and no one was coming to fix a mistake. And yet, by the time the room has fully darkened, supper is somehow ready. But what kind of supper? This is where I want you to pause, because the picture in your mind may be completely wrong. When modern people imagine a family meal in the 1700s, they usually borrow from paintings, films, and holiday nostalgia. A long table, a roasted bird, candles, maybe a pie cooling near a window, wooden bowls, golden light, smiling children, something rustic but abundant. It is a beautiful image, and in some wealthier homes, something like it could exist. But for most ordinary families, that was not supper.
Not most nights.
Not even close. The main meal of the day was usually not eaten in the evening at all. That is the first adjustment we have to make. In the world this family lives in, dinner often came around midday or early afternoon, when the morning's physical labor had already emptied the body and more labor still waited before dark. That was when the substantial food was served, if the household had any substantial food. The evening meal, supper, was usually smaller, quieter, less ceremonious, and often built from what remained. So what is in the pot tonight? Maybe beans that had been simmering for hours with a small piece of salt pork to give them fat and flavor. Maybe cornmeal mush, thick and warm, made from dried field corn ground into meal. Maybe a piece of dense cornbread. Maybe some cheese if the cow had given enough milk and the household had managed its dairy well. Perhaps there are leftovers from the noon meal, carefully saved and warmed again, because nothing edible in this house is allowed to vanish without purpose. That may sound plain. It was plain. But plain is not the same as unimportant. For a body that has worked since dawn, a bowl of warm mush beside a fire can matter more than a feast served to someone who has never been truly hungry. For a child who has spent the last hour carrying water, even a small piece of cornbread can feel like an answer. The meal does not have to be beautiful to be serious. It does not have to be varied to be welcomed. It has to be enough.
And was it always enough?
That is the question sitting quietly beneath every colonial supper. Some nights, yes. Some seasons, probably. After harvest, after slaughter, after good weather, after a cow gives well and the garden has not failed, the table may feel secure enough. But in leaner stretches, after a bad crop during a long winter, when stores are lower than anyone wants to admit, the same meal can carry anxiety inside it. A mother serving portions knows who needs more and who must be satisfied with less. She knows whether the salt pork will last. She knows how much cornmeal remains. She knows what must be saved for tomorrow, and no one at the table may say out loud what she is calculating. This is one of the things that makes the ordinary meal so revealing. Food was not simply eaten, it was managed. Salt pork was one of the great pillars of ordinary colonial food because it solved a problem that shaped everything. How do you keep meat in a world without refrigeration? A pig slaughtered in autumn could be salted, packed, stored, and stretched through months when fresh meat was rare. The meat itself might not have been elegant. It could be tough, salty, repetitive, and humble, but it carried fat and protein into dishes that desperately needed both. A small piece could season a whole pot. A little grease could make bland food satisfying. A slice fried in a spider pan over coals could change the feeling of a meal. Corn was the other pillar, especially for ordinary households. Not sweet corn, not the soft summer corn we imagine today, but field corn dried and ground into meal. Cornmeal could become hasty pudding, Indian pudding, Johnny cakes, mush, cakes cooked on a board before the fire, or something thick enough to hold a spoon upright. It was cheap, adaptable, filling, and everywhere. And here is the strange thing. Constraint did not make every meal joyless. It made certain things precious. The first berries of summer mattered because they would not last. Fresh fish mattered because it belonged to a season and a place. Apple cider in autumn mattered because it arrived after work, and pressing and waiting. Even a warm pot of beans could carry comfort when the room was cold and the day had been long enough. We have so much variety now that appetite itself can become confused. They had far fewer choices, but when something appeared outside the ordinary rhythm, it landed with force. Have you ever stood in front of a full refrigerator and felt unable to choose anything while a person in this house may have waited all day for one bowl of food and received it with more attention than we give an entire table? That contrast is not meant to shame us. It is meant to wake something up. Because the colonial meal was not rich, but it was connected. The family knew what they were eating. They knew who had grown it, carried it, preserved it, cooked it, stretched it, and saved it. There was no mystery between labor and food. That kind of knowledge can be heavy, but it is knowledge nonetheless. Now come closer to the table, because how they ate may surprise you almost as much as what they ate. Do not imagine every person sitting with their own plate, their own fork, their own glass, their own preferences being gently accommodated. Many ordinary families in the early and mid-1700s did not use individual plates in the way we do now. They might eat from wooden trenchers, shallow dishes carved from wood, and those trenchers were often shared. 2 people to 1 dish was not unusual. A husband and wife might share. Siblings might share. A child might eat from what was placed between them and someone else. To us, that feels intimate or uncomfortable depending on how we imagine it. To them it was normal. Forks were not yet universal in ordinary households, especially earlier in the century. A knife, a spoon, and the hands did much of the work. Napkins were practical, not decorative, because fingers touched food often. Children were not being offered alternative meals, and no one was asking whether the texture bothered them. You ate what was there in the portion given from the dish available, because the table was not a place built around individual desire.
And what did they drink?
Often not plain water. That detail still catches people, but wells and streams could be unsafe, contaminated by animals, runoff, nearby privies, and everything else that comes with a world before modern sanitation. Many families drank cider, small beer, or other lightly alcoholic drinks because fermentation made them safer than questionable water. Children might drink watered-down cider or small beer without anyone seeing it as shocking. In that world, it was not indulgence. It was practical caution.
So imagine the supper now.
The light is low. The fire gives most of what the room has. The food is plain and warm. A shared dish sits between 2 people. Cornbread is broken. A wooden cup or tankard is passed. The youngest children may not even sit fully at the table if space is limited. Someone stands, someone waits. Someone is handed food rather than served as an equal. There is little conversation at first. because meals in many households do not begin with chatter. They begin with order. And that brings us to the part of the evening that may feel most foreign, the table itself. Because in a 1700s home, the table was not merely furniture. It was not only where food was placed, it was a stage where the entire structure of the household became visible. If you knew how to read it, you could see authority, gender, age, rank, obedience, duty, and belonging, arranged around that one surface. Who sat first? Who spoke? Who waited? Who served? Who received the best portion? Who was expected to stay quiet? Those questions tell you more about the family than the meal ever could. At the head of the table sat the father, and this was not a casual custom or a sentimental tradition. In colonial law, theology, and social expectation, he was the governing authority of the household. The family was often understood as a small commonwealth, with the father ruling under God in the same way magistrates ruled the colony. That may sound extreme to modern ears, but to many people in that world, it felt natural, lawful, and religiously ordered. His place at the table expressed that authority before he said a word. The wife usually sat opposite him or in the position from which she could manage serving, children, portions, and the flow of the meal. Do not mistake that for equality in the modern sense. Under the legal doctrine known as coverture, a married woman's legal identity was largely absorbed into her husband's. She could not act independently in many legal matters. He represented the household publicly. He had authority that was reinforced by law, church, and custom. But inside the room, her labor made the household function. That is the tension you must hold to understand this world. He presided. She sustained. He was recognized. She was necessary. And necessity did not always come with power. Children were arranged according to age, usefulness, and status, often with older children nearer the parents and younger ones lower in the order of attention. Servants, or hired help if they ate with the family, sat below the children or in the least honored places. And in some households, the placement of a salt cellar on the table could mark social rank in a very literal way. Those seated above the salt were closer to status and honor. Those below it, children, servants, lower-ranking guests, were physically placed in a position of lesser importance. Imagine that. A simple object on the table saying, without a word, who mattered more. We have inherited phrases from customs like this without feeling their original weight. Below the salt became an expression of lower status, but in that room it was not a metaphor, it was location. You could see your place, you could feel it. Now let us talk about the children, because this is where many modern viewers feel the strongest reaction. Children in respectable colonial households were not encouraged to express themselves at the table the way many are today. They were expected to wait, to listen, to control their bodies, to accept food without complaint, and often to speak only when spoken to. Conduct manuals of the period instructed children not to sit before being invited, not to interrupt superiors, not to stare, not to reach greedily, not to behave as if the meal belonged to them. In some homes, especially stricter ones, children might stand during meals rather than sit with adults. Let that picture settle for a moment. A child standing behind or beside the grown people, waiting to be handed food, eating quietly, not asking for more, not negotiating, not complaining. Through modern eyes, it can feel harsh, and in many ways it was harsh. But if we want to understand the world honestly, we have to understand what parents thought they were doing. They were not most of the time trying to be cruel for cruelty's sake. They believed they were forming character. To them, a child who learned to wait, to obey, to accept, to remain quiet in the presence of elders was being prepared for a hard world where self-command might mean survival, respectability, even salvation. Do we agree with that? Not entirely, perhaps not at all in some parts. But the table was not merely feeding children. It was training them. Every supper repeated the lesson. This is where you stand. This is when you speak. This is what you are given. This is how you control yourself. This is how the world is ordered.
And what did that do to a child's inner life?
That is a question the records rarely answer. History tells us the rules more easily than it tells us how a 7-year-old felt while following them. Maybe some children accepted it because they knew nothing else. Maybe some resented it silently. Maybe some watched the adults closely, learning not only manners but power. Maybe the oldest child, seated nearer the parents, felt the first taste of status. Maybe the youngest stood half asleep with a wooden spoon in hand, thinking only of the warmth of the hearth and the hope of getting enough. That is the trouble with ordinary history. The rules survive, the feelings often disappear. But sometimes, if we stay in the room long enough, we can feel the pressure of them. Before anyone eats, there is prayer. Not a quick, polite phrase, not a rushed formality muttered while people are already reaching for food, but a serious act that marks the meal as part of the moral structure of the day. In many Protestant households, the father leads it. His authority is not only practical but spiritual. He is expected to guide the household, to discipline it, to speak over it, to answer for it in ways that now feel almost impossible to imagine. So the room quiets, the fire moves, the food waits, the children hold still, the father speaks. And in that moment, the table becomes more than a table. It becomes church, courtroom, schoolroom, and family all at once. Values are not being discussed as ideas. They are being performed through posture, silence, order, and obedience. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it not as history, but as a mirror. When you eat with the people in your house, what is the table doing besides holding food? Who speaks most? Who notices what is missing? Who gets up when something is needed? Who eats last without anyone saying so? Who carries the invisible work of making the meal happen? Who has authority, and where did that authority come from? I am not asking because I think the 1700s had the answer. They did not. Much of that world was unequal in ways we have rightly challenged and moved beyond, but they understood, maybe more clearly than we do, that a family table is never neutral. It teaches something. Every meal teaches something, even if no one names the lesson. In the colonial house, the lesson was hierarchy. In ours, it may be distraction.
Or hurry.
Or affection. Or the strange modern habit of being physically together while everyone's attention is somewhere else. That is why this old table matters, not because we should return to it, but because it forces us to notice our own. Now the meal is ending. The food has been eaten. The shared dishes are scraped clean. The cornbread is gone or carefully saved. The cup has made its final round. The children are either relieved, sleepy, restless, or already thinking of the warmth near the fire. The father has presided. The mother has watched everything. Who ate? Who needed more? What remains? What can be stretched into morning? What must be cleaned before sleep? What cannot be left for rats, damp, or carelessness? And this is where another hidden part of the evening begins. Because when the family meal ends, the day does not end for the woman who made it possible. The table must be cleared, the vessels wiped or washed with limited water, the leftovers protected, the fire adjusted, the tools put where they belong, the children watched, corrected, prepared for bed, the room restored from eating, back into working, sleeping, and surviving. And while the house slowly moves toward night, she is still moving through tasks that no one will remember unless she fails to do them. But before we follow her into that long after-supper labor, there is another thing we need to understand first.
The light.
Because as the fire lowers and the room darkens, the family faces a choice that sounds small to us but was not small to them at all. Should they light a candle?
One candle. One small flame.
One extra hour of visibility. And once you understand what that hour of light actually cost, the entire colonial evening becomes more fragile, more intimate, and more astonishing than it was before. And that is where the evening changes again, because after the meal, after the table has shown everyone their place, after the bowls have been scraped and the last warm mouthful has disappeared, the the family faces one of the quietest but most revealing decisions of the whole night.
Do they spend a candle? Not light a candle.
Spend one.
Because that is how you have to think of it in this world.
A candle in the 1700s was not a small, decorative object pulled from a drawer whenever the room felt dim. It was stored labor. It was fat, smoke, smell, time, preparation, and the memory of one long autumn day that everyone in the household probably dreaded. So before you imagine a beautiful room glowing with dozens of soft flames, I want you to stop for a moment and ask the question an ordinary family would have asked without even needing to say it aloud. Is this worth the light? That question sat inside every evening. If the fire gave enough glow to move through the room, maybe no candle was needed. If someone had to mend a sleeve, read a passage, count household stores, tend a sick child, or do work that required the eyes, then perhaps one candle would be brought out. But even then it was not casual. A candle meant that something limited was being consumed minute by minute, and when it was gone, someone would have to make another, buy another, or sit in the dark.
So what was that little flame actually made of?
For most ordinary families, it was tallow.
Animal fat.
Usually the rendered fat of sheep or cattle saved through the year and processed after the autumn slaughter when fat was available in quantity. That timing was not sentimental, it was practical. Animals that could not be fed through winter were killed in the fall, and their meat, hides, bones and fat were all used because a household that wasted animal fat was wasting future light. But the word candle making can mislead us. It sounds almost charming now, something you might do as a craft project on a quiet afternoon, with clean jars and pleasant scents. Colonial candle making was not charming. It was heavy, hot, greasy, repetitive work, and the smell was something no one in the house could escape. The fat had to be cut, melted down in large kettles, strained, clarified, and kept hot enough for dipping. The air filled with the odor of rendered animal fat, a thick smell that clung to hair, cloth, walls, and memory. Can you imagine spending an entire day making the thing you will later burn carefully, inch by inch, because winter is long and light is limited? That is exactly what they did. Wicks made of linen, cotton, hemp, or other fibers were tied to rods dipped into hot tallow, lifted out, cooled, dipped again, lifted again, cooled again. One layer was never enough. Each candle grew slowly through repetition, and a usable candle might require 30 or 40 dips before it was thick enough to burn properly. Now multiply that by hundreds, because a household might need 300 or more candles for a year, and even that number was not abundance. It was caution.
1 candle a day, roughly.
If you were careful, if you did not waste, if illness, sowing, winter darkness, guests, childbirth, storms, or fear did not demand more than expected. Now here is where light becomes social history, because not every candle was equal. The kind of candle burning in your home revealed what sort of life you could afford after dark. Tallow candles were the ordinary kind, cheap, homemade, smoky, uneven, and unpleasant by modern standards. They could gutter, drip, smell greasy, and require constant trimming. If the blackened wick grew too long, the flame smoked heavily, and the candle burned too fast. That trimming was called snuffing, and candle snuffers, little scissor-like tools, were not fancy ornaments. They were necessary equipment for keeping a poor flame useful. A tallow candle might burn for only a couple of hours under decent conditions. A better candle could last longer. Beeswax burned cleaner, smelled sweeter, and produced a steadier light. But beeswax was expensive, often reserved for churches, wealthier households, or special uses. Spermaceti candles, made from waxy oil connected to the sperm whale industry, burned brighter and cleaner still, but for most ordinary families, they belonged to a different world. To burn fine candles regularly in a farmhouse kitchen would have been like lighting coins on fire. And that is not a metaphor. It was a direct conversion of resources into visibility.
One small flame, 1 hour of work, one choice.
So when a candle is finally lit in this house, do not imagine the room becoming bright. A single tallow candle gives a very small amount of light by modern standards, closer to the faint glow of something fragile than to the lamps we use without thinking. The fire still does most of the work, casting wide, shifting amber light across the center of the room, while the candle gives a narrower circle of use, enough for a needle, a page, a face, a worried hand resting on a blanket. And this is the part I find almost painful to think about. The women who made those candles were often the ones who burned them last. Because after the meal, after the table, after the children began drifting towards sleep, the woman of the house was still not finished. She might have been working since before dawn, but there were garments to mend, wool to spin, food to prepare for morning, household stores to check, children to settle, embers to manage, and the 1,000 small tasks that kept a family from falling apart, but rarely appeared in any official record. There is an old saying, a man works from sun to sun, but a woman's work is never done. It sounds like a complaint until you stand inside this room and realize that it was also a plain description of how the household functioned. The father's outdoor labor was real. It was hard. It could break the body. But when darkness made the fields impossible, much of that labor ended. The woman's work changed shape. It moved inward. It moved closer to the fire. It moved into candlelight. What does she do in those hours? Maybe she sits near the hearth with a stocking in her lap, repairing the heel because fabric is too valuable to discard. Maybe she mends a child's shirt torn on a fence rail. Maybe she spins flax or wool, drawing fiber into thread while the wheel hums in the room, with a low, repetitive sound that everyone has heard so often they no longer hear it. Maybe she checks the remaining meal, the salt, the dried apples, the candles themselves, silently calculating how long winter will be if the cold comes early. And here is the detail that changes everything about this labor. Cloth was expensive. Not expensive like a luxury handbag or a decorative object, but expensive in the old brutal way. A necessity becomes expensive when every stage of making it requires human time. A sheep had to be shorn. Wool had to be cleaned, carded, spun, woven, cut, stitched, fitted, and repaired. Linen took its own long chain of growing flax, processing it, spinning it, and weaving it. Before industrial textile production changed the world, a single garment carried an astonishing amount of labor inside it. So a tear in a sleeve was not small. A worn heel in a stocking was not small. A child outgrowing clothing was not small. Every piece of fabric in the house represented hours, days, sometimes weeks of work. And that is why the mending never truly ended. Clothing was repaired, altered, passed down, cut apart, remade, turned into rags, and used until almost nothing remained. When we throw fabric away now, we are throwing away something machines made cheap. When they held a garment in their hands, they were holding labor. So imagine the woman near the candle, eyes tired, hands still moving, while the rest of the room begins to slow. Does anyone thank her? Perhaps sometimes. Does anyone fully count the work?
Almost never.
That is one of the quiet tragedies of domestic history. The work that keeps life possible often disappears because it succeeds. A meal eaten leaves no monument. A shirt mended becomes ordinary again. A candle made in November burns in January and is gone. A child kept warm through the night wakes in the morning as if warmth had simply happened. But it did not simply happen.
Someone made it happen.
And often, that someone was still awake when everyone else had begun to sleep. There is one woman from this period whose records make this invisible world visible with unusual force. Her name was Martha Ballard, a midwife in Maine who began keeping a diary in the late 18th century and continued for decades. She delivered hundreds of babies, crossed rivers, traveled in dangerous weather, made medicines, tended the sick, and returned home to the same domestic tasks that waited for every woman of her time. Her diary records these things plainly, almost without drama: births, weather, illness, spinning, baking, mending, exhaustion. And that plainness is what makes it powerful. She might attend a birth through the night, come home, sleep briefly, and then record that she spun thread or finished stockings or baked. She did not underline the absurdity. She did not pause to announce herself heroic. The work was simply there, and she did it. For years, some historians overlooked records like hers because they seemed too repetitive, too ordinary, too domestic. But that repetition is the point. It shows a life in which necessity returned every morning and every evening, no matter what had happened the night before. I want to ask you something here, because it is hard to sit with this labor and not bring the question forward. How much work in a life disappears because no one counts it? How much care becomes invisible because it prevents a crisis instead of creating a visible achievement? The colonial woman at the fire did not have the language we might use now for unpaid labor, mental load, invisible work, or emotional management. She simply had children to keep alive, food to stretch, cloth to preserve, illness to watch, fire to bank, and a household that would punish everyone if she stopped noticing things. And when that candle burned lower, she had to decide whether the task in her hands was worth the last inch of light. Now turn your attention to the children, because while the mother works and the fire lowers, bedtime approaches in a house where night is not gentle. We tend to imagine children being tucked in with soft stories, quiet reassurance, perhaps a kiss on the forehead, and a promise that nothing bad will happen. But in the 1700s, childhood moved under a different sky. The dark was not treated as imaginary. Death was not hidden as carefully from children. Fear was not always softened before being handed to them. So what did bedtime sound like? It may have begun with prayer. One of the most widely taught prayers for children was the one many people still know in altered form. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. That line can strike modern ears as shockingly dark for a child. If I should die before I wake. We might instinctively want to remove it, soften it, protect the child from the thought. But in that world, the line was not abstract. Children did die, often. In some colonial communities, childhood mortality was high enough that almost every family knew loss directly. A fever could take a child. Diphtheria could move through a town with terrifying speed. Smallpox, infection, childbirth complications, accidents, winter illness. All of these were close enough to ordinary life that pretending death did not exist would have seemed less like kindness and more like denial. So the prayer was not only fear, it was structure. It gave a child words for the possibility that everyone in the house already knew. If the worst happens in the night, you are held. If the dark takes more than sleep, you are not outside the care of God. Whether we share that theology or not, we have to understand the emotional function of it. It did not make death less real. It made death speakable. And after prayer were their stories. Sometimes, but not always, the kind we expect. The gentle bedtime story with soft rhythm, safe danger, and guaranteed comfort is a much later invention. Children in the colonial period often heard the same folk stories, moral warnings, religious lessons, and frightening accounts that adults told one another. Stories of forests, strangers, spirits, providence, punishment, survival, obedience, and consequences. The world beyond the cleared land was dangerous not only because of weather and animals, but because people believed the unseen world pressed close to the visible one, especially at night.
Imagine being a child in that house.
The room is dim, the fire is low, Shadows move across beams and walls. Adults speak in serious voices. You have heard stories of wolves, sickness, souls, storms, spirits, and children who did not wake. You may be lying beside a sibling, or near your parents, or on a trundle bed, rolled out from beneath the larger bed. You are not alone, but the dark is still large. What does a child fear at bedtime? Maybe the same thing children fear now beneath all the changing language: separation. The moment the adult turns away, the moment the room becomes less certain. The feeling that the dark contains something unnamed. But colonial children had something many modern children do not have in the same form. They had a shared explanation of the dark, a religious structure, a set of prayers, a household that understood night not as empty space, but as a spiritual and physical threshold. That did not remove fear, but it gave fear a place to go. The children finally settle, or at least they are expected to. And now we come to another part of the evening that can surprise modern people deeply, where everyone sleeps. Because sleep in the 1700s was rarely private in the way we assume sleep should be private now. The idea that every person has a separate bed and, ideally, a separate room is very recent by historical standards. In this house, space is limited, beds are valuable, and warmth is too precious to isolate. How many beds does the family own? Perhaps fewer than you think. A good bed was one of the most valuable possessions in a household, sometimes worth as much as a small structure or a major portion of a family's property. A feather bed, a proper bedstead, curtains, bolsters, and bedding were not casual furniture. They were wealth. They appeared in wills. They were passed down. They were protected. The best bed belonged to the parents, and in some households, especially wealthier ones, a fine bed could even be displayed in a parlour as a sign of standing. But in an ordinary farmhouse, the sleeping arrangement was practical above all else. The parents slept in the main bed. The youngest children might sleep in a trundle bed rolled out from underneath it. Older children might sleep in the loft, on pallets, on straw-filled mattresses, on benches that converted into sleeping places, or wherever space allowed. Servants or hired workers, if present, slept in the least comfortable places, attic spaces, corners, near the foot of a bed, or wherever the household order placed them. The hierarchy of the dinner table did not disappear at night.
It only lay down.
But this closeness was not only hierarchy, it was also heat. Bodies warmed one another. A child sleeping near siblings was warmer than a child alone. A room full of breath held heat better than an empty one. The same closeness that might feel suffocating to a modern person could also be the difference between comfort and cold. And here is a question worth holding for a moment. What did it feel like to grow up never expecting sleep to be private? To hear another person breathing before you lost consciousness every night? To wake because a sibling shifted, because a parent coughed, because the rope bed creaked, because the corn husk mattress rustled, because the fire popped once in the dark? For us, sleep is often imagined as retreat from other people. For them, sleep was part of household life. Even strangers sometimes shared beds in inns and crowded homes. Travelers expected it. Hospitality required it. Privacy was less important than shelter. A person might arrive late, cold, and tired, and be offered part of a bed already occupied. To refuse too delicately could seem rude. That feels almost impossible to us now, but it was normal because the basic problem of night was not comfort in our sense. It was getting through it. There were courtship customs too, including bundling, where a young couple might spend the night in the same bed fully clothed, separated by blankets or even a board, under the watchful knowledge of the family. To modern ears, this sounds both intimate and absurd, but the logic was practical. Travel after dark was dangerous, candles were costly, winter nights were long, and supervised closeness inside the household seemed safer to many communities than unsupervised meetings elsewhere. The past is often stranger when it is practical. By now the house has settled into its nighttime arrangement, but it is not silent. That is another modern mistake. We imagine old houses at night as quiet, but pre-modern darkness had its own noise. Wood shifted in the cold, wind moved around loose walls, animals rustled outside, insects in summer could be overwhelming, ice might creak in winter. Someone coughed, a child murmured, a rope bed complained when a body turned. The fire exhaled softly under ash, and before sleep fully took them, there may have been one more stretch of evening life, because colonial evenings were not only grim labor and solemn prayer. People were still people. They got bored, they laughed, they argued, they played, they listened, they talked, because there was no glowing rectangle to interrupt the room. So what did a family do before bed, when there was no radio, no television, no phone, no streaming, no endless supply of content waiting to fill silence? They made the evening out of what was available. If the household had books, someone might read aloud while others listened and worked by the fire. Reading was often communal rather than private. A book could become an event in the room. Scripture was read, certainly, but so were almanacs, moral tales, newspapers, pamphlets, and eventually novels, and lighter reading when families had access to them. Poor Richard's almanac, with its weather notes, practical advice, and sharp little sayings, was part of the shared mental furniture of many colonial households. Music, where available, changed the room completely. A fiddle could turn the end of labor into something like celebration. A girl in a wealthier household might play a keyboard instrument as part of the accomplishments expected of her. In humbler settings, a fiddle, a voice, a psalm tune, a reel, or a song remembered by someone near the fire could give the room a shape different from work. The body that had labored all day could still tap a foot. That matters. Games existed too, despite the suspicion of stricter clergy. Cards, dice, backgammon, the game of goose, blind man's buff, and other amusements could fill the hours before sleep. People played, laughed, competed, gambled sometimes, and probably annoyed each other in ways that would feel perfectly familiar if we could hear them. The colonial evening was not always quiet dignity. It could be noisy, funny, tense, irritating, warm, and very human. But conversation may have been the great entertainment of the age. And I do not mean conversation as filler because they lacked better options. I mean conversation as a skill, a practice, a central form of social life. In a world without broadcasts, without podcasts, without instant commentary, people worked out their opinions with one another. News was discussed aloud, religious questions were debated, local matters were argued over, political ideas, including the ideas that would eventually help shape revolution, moved through rooms where people had little to do after supper except talk.
Ask yourself this and be honest.
When was the last time you had a conversation that was not competing with a screen? Not a quick exchange, not comments sent between tasks, a real conversation with nothing else open, nothing glowing in your hand, no easy escape from the silence between thoughts. The colonial evening could be boring, certainly. It could be restrictive, cold, exhausting, and uncomfortable. But boredom sometimes made room for depth. Silence sometimes forced speech to become real. The lack of entertainment created a kind of attention that we now have to fight to recover.
I'm not saying their world was better. It was not.
But it did ask something from the people inside it that our world often does not. Stay here with these people, in this room, with this light, until the night is done. And then sometimes the night changed suddenly. A cough. That is all it might take. The house is nearly asleep. The fire is low. The mother has finally set aside her work, or almost has. The children are breathing in the dark, then one of them coughs in a way that sounds different. Wet, tight, persistent. Not the ordinary cough of sleep, but the kind that wakes a parent's body before the mind has fully understood why. What do you do now? In our world, the answer begins with tools and systems. A thermometer, a phone, medicine in a cabinet, a pharmacy, a nurse line, a doctor, an emergency room if needed. We live inside a medical structure so large and familiar that we forget how extraordinary it is. In the 1700s, most families had none of that. Doctors were scarce, especially in rural areas. Trained physicians were few, roads were bad, travel was slow, and calling a doctor in the middle of the night might be impossible, too expensive, or uselessly late. For many households, especially outside cities, the first and often only medical authority was the mother or another experienced woman in the household. Thank you for spending this evening inside that house with me. If one detail stayed with you, the cost of a candle, the fear of a dead fire, the children praying before sleep, the mother still working after everyone else had slowed, or the strange intimacy of a family breathing together in the dark, tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know which moment made the past feel closest. And if you have come this far through the firelight and the supper table and the candle smoke and the long dark work of people whose names were mostly never written down, thank you. There are more forgotten rooms to enter, more ordinary lives to recover, more nights like this one waiting in the shadows of history. Until then, take care of the people in your house tonight. Light something warm if you can. And when the last screen goes dark, listen for a moment to the room around you. It may have more life in it than you think.